Aloha, everyone. I'd like to say thank you very much for taking the time to be here today, listen to my talk. It's unfortunate that we can't be doing this in person. Hopefully, that will change again in the future. It is just an absolute wonderful experience to be actually speaking at it. I was able to do the first Loco Moco Sec, and then the second one I couldn't get into the country because apparently I was stealing American jobs. I'm a Canadian. And then this year, well, yeah, it's been interesting, let's say the very least. So, enough about that. I've been doing security in one form or another now for a very long time, as he was just saying there. And it's been quite an adventure. I mean, if I'm being honest with myself, I started right about 1983 when I was duping video games and selling them to kids in school. That's a long way back at this point. And I'm imagining, yeah, that's just too long ago. But anyway, but now, through the breadth and depth of everything that I've done over the years, I am now working in a very amazing role as a global advisory CISO for Duo Security, which is now part of Cisco Systems. So there's the Duo, there's the Cisco. And the talk today is about zero trust. And I tried to be as least vendory as possible because I don't like sitting in vendor talks, so I'm not going to do that to you. Now, the premise here is we're talking about Palekana, and I'm hoping I got the pronunciation exactly right, because one of the things that I've been very fortunate, I've been able to go to Hawaii multiple times over the years, and I really have gotten a real love for the culture, love for the island and the society. And this is one of those words that really jumped out at me, and I'm just going to read it just because I don't want to make sure I don't get it wrong. The word means to be safe and protected. It also means to ward off danger and express actions of being safe. So this seemed rather highly applicable to security in general, and I wanted to take this and lock it up with zero trust. Now, zero trust, let's be honest, in a lot of ways, people see this as a marketing buzzword. They're partly correct, but the reality is there's a great deal of meat on the bone. There's a lot of substance to this. Now, the idea here is it's not that we don't trust anyone. It's just you want to verify who the people are. You want to verify their devices. You want to verify their applications before they ever gain access to whatever it is they need to gain access to. Now, the reason being is when we're born, we have a default to trust. Now, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about talking to strangers, and this is one of the premises of the book, is that when we're born into this world, we trust by default because we need to find food, we need to find shelter, we need to be safe. The problem is that doesn't always translate into a security sense. More often than not, it doesn't at all. So we have to be able to verify users. We have to look at things in a different way because one of the phrases I absolutely hate is the new normal. I hate it because it's more of a case of these are days that end in Y. We are now in a place where remote work is par for the course. And we have to really look at the different type of security issues that we have to contend with that we may not have thought of when we were in an office in the past, in the before times. So what we have to do is look at how are we doing our authentication, because the idea here is, quite simply, the perimeter is anywhere an access decision is being made. And you can use all manner of device to do this. You can have push technology, you can have soft tokens, U2F, wearables, biometrics. There's all sorts of different ways to handle authentication. So why do we keep going back to passwords? Something to consider. You want to make sure that when you're dealing with your device that it is secure, and you don't want to be introducing security vulnerabilities into the organization. You don't want to be adding a security element that shouldn't, or a negative security element to your security applications that are facing the internet. So when I talk about zero trust, the problem that I have here is that there are so many different competing ideas as to what it means. And if I went around a room of 100 people and said, what is love? Can pretty much be guaranteed I'm going to get 100 different answers. So the way I like to approach it is from the concept that, well, let's put it this way. Everything's on fire. If we look at that as our baseline, then we can move on from there. You want to make sure you're securing your users, your devices, your applications. You want to look at it from the perspective of workload, workforce, and workplace. It's three major buckets that you can put fundamentally everything into. Obviously, there will be outliers, but it's not a hard and fast rule. Because we have to consider that when we're building applications, when we're pushing out product to our customers, that things are going to go wrong. And there's been more than a few times where I've been in organizations where something did go horribly wrong. One company I used to work for, they pushed out code It was a major financial institution, and thankfully I wasn't there anymore at the time because they had a horrible weekend. But somebody put a comma in the wrong place in their code. As a result, it brought the entire internet banking system for that particular financial institution to its knees for several days. Think about that from a security perspective. How much money would be lost for every minute, for every hour, for every day that you were out? Not just from a financial institution, but for whatever company you happen to be working for. You might be selling teddy bears, you might be building centrifuges. Obviously, you're going to have different risk profiles, but there are costs associated with being out. Now, as a security practitioner who's been doing this for a very long time, I tend to feel like this, and I know this is a shared reality for far too many of us. So what is zero trust in a wider sense? So if we look back to about 2003, 2004 timeframe, a group called the Jericho Forum put out a paper on deperimeterization. This was, effectively speaking, the stake in the ground for what would later become known as zero trust. In 2010, a Forrester analyst named John Kindervog, he coined the term zero trust. Now, this is actually a good thing because it got people to pay attention. Because a lot of what zero trust is about getting back to core fundamentals, dealing with the security aspects that, honestly, we should have been doing for the last 25, 30 years anyway. And if we have to wrap it up in a nice, tidy package and call it zero trust, so be it. That is absolutely fantastic. If it works, it works. Now, Google had a great example where they put themselves out there as something to be discussed. They created their version of zero trust, which is called BeyondCorp. And they published papers about it, and they had follow-up papers about it as well. And they were pretty transparent about it, which was absolutely fantastic because it served as a lesson learned for a wider audience. This was a good thing. Now, you have to take into mind it took many, many years for them to get to this stage. So if you're in an organization that's looking at going towards a zero trust type of framework, you have to understand it's going to take a long time and not to lose faith. And also, don't try to boil the ocean. Pick your battles as you go along. Network zone segmentation, user management, device management, multi-factor authentication, all of these things that you can get your hands around to reduce risk in your organization is going to be the key. Because fundamentally, when we get down to it, that's what zero trust is all about. Reducing risk in your organization, reducing costs overall, and getting a better night's sleep. Now, there's a really cool book in 2017 that came out. It was Zero Trust Networks on O'Reilly Publications. And I don't know anything about the authors. I don't have a stake in it, but it's a really good book to read if you want to read more. So we have to understand the landscape has changed, never more true than where we are now. We have everyone is pivoting from what was the on-prem solution routine to cloud-enabled applications. If we're being honest with each other, I mean, there's a great number of companies out there that are still very much entrenched in what we can only call a hybrid model where they have on-prem plus cloud implementations. But the movement has begun. People are now pivoting away from that. And now when we look at things, we have to understand that people are remote. They are looking for the ability to work from anywhere, and we have to give them a security paradigm that I can't believe I just said paradigm. I have to kick my own butt for that. But we have to look at it from the perspective of they have to be able to have the same security experience, the same trust experience if they're at home, if they're on the road, if they're in the office, whatever it happens to be. I like to hold on to the idea that we'll be in the office again one day because, let's be honest, there's only so much of this we can all take. We have to look at the trends. We have the multi-cloud access. We have to look at enabling BYOD for organizations because, let's be honest, back in March when a lot of companies had to pivot to being remote, and some in as short as 10 hours. I actually spoke with one organization in the States that had literally 10 hours from when they were told to prepare to bug out to when they were given the get out of Dodge signal. There's no way you can actually pivot in such a way that you have the supplies you need in order to backfill for all your suddenly remote workers. And they didn't. So they were able to look for devices, and not every organization was fortunate enough to be able to get these things, laptops and so on for remote workers. So in a lot of cases, companies had to resort to BYOD in a way to make sure that they were keeping the lights on, make sure that business continued. But you have to make sure that you're doing it in a safe and secure fashion. In a zero trust type of model, you have the framework in place to be able to look at the posture assessment of the device to ensure that the person that is on the device is one that you're expecting to come in, and you can verify that they are not just somebody that happened to find a password on a Post-it note in an airport lounge. And then fundamentally, we look at it from the idea of it's all about breach prevention. We want to reduce the risk overall. Now, we've always looked at the traditional perimeter as, I have a wall, I have a moat, you can't come in unless I say so. The zero trust approach really flips that on its head, and it's about where an access decision is being made, be it in the application, the data, whatever it happens to be. You want to make sure that you are approaching it from this perspective, because the idea of the castle wall routine is really a deprecated notion. Pardon me. And we have to evolve beyond that. So here's some very easy high-level steps to walk through conceptually for how we approach zero trust. First of all, you want to go through and confirm all the user identities within your organization. You want to make sure that the people that are in your organization that have access to resources are the ones that are fundamentally supposed to be there. Now, when I say that, I mean, a great example is I had built a system for an organization many, many moons ago where I put another account on each one of the servers. I think there was about 10 servers in total for this particular implementation back in the on-prem days. And I put an account in there that looked like a legitimate system account. It was a local administrator account that only I knew. Now, I didn't do this for nefarious purposes. I did this in case I locked myself out of the system. Because I was building it, I was the only one maintaining it. I had to try and make sure that everything was on, tickety-boo. But 2 years after I left the company, I remembered about these accounts, and I called them up and I said, don't be mad, but you may want to check these systems. And sure enough, they did check the systems, and they were still there, and thankfully nobody had ever accessed those accounts or tried to. But that's just it. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and I've put down a few bricks along the way. So step two, after you've confirmed all the user identities are the ones that are fundamentally supposed to be there, you want to have access into, visibility into the access that they are looking for. So do you have somebody in finance that is trying to access, your code repositories on GitHub? Or do you have somebody that is doing back-end system maintenance that suddenly has taken an interest in HR systems? This shouldn't happen. You should be able to monitor this as well as ensure that they can't do these sort of things. Now, the third step in this is looking at ensuring device security. Now, the point being here is you want to make sure that the devices in your inventory are patched to current or N-1, or conversely, if you're doing BYOD, you are able to enforce saying your browser has to be patched to X, or things to that effect, or your operating system has to be this level before you can ride the ride. And that's not a bad thing. Not everybody enjoys that, but let's be honest. It's not about hurt feelings. We're really about reducing risk for the organization. And then going back to the example of people accessing things that they shouldn't be accessing, we can look in step 4 about enforcing contextual policies where you say that somebody in finance can't be accessing a mainframe system, can't be going into a code repository and making changes to code. You're able to contain that using a zero trust approach. And then the fifth step in this is about securing access to all the applications. So ostensibly what this is you have what, for all intents and purposes, is a reverse proxy where you have your users connect to this using multi-factor authentication to authenticate who they are. And once they get in, then it is presented with all the applications that they need to access in order to get business done. Seems pretty simple. Another way to look at it is going through like this. We establish user trust identity, establish trust in user identities, evaluate the trustworthiness of the device. Is it a device that you've seen before? Enforcing access policies on user device combinations. So if you have, Dave coming in from Canada on a device that you've never seen before, then you can say, this doesn't seem right. Or why is Dave coming into my system when he doesn't work here? These are the kind of policies that you can look to control. Enabling secure connections to all the applications. When you have, most organizations are now pivoting, thankfully, finally, over to SaaS-based implementations for a lot of their applications. There's no reason that, any John Q. public can connect to it from a coffee shop. There's just no reason for it. Now, once you have all of these steps addressed and you are collecting all sorts of data, you can then use that data to look for anomalies to see how people are operating within your network, and also to ensure that they are not going into resources or not attempting to go into resources that they shouldn't have access to. Now, I talked about, the deprecated notions, and that's one of those things that I've learned over time is that castles don't scale. This may sound obvious to many, But it's amazing how many people don't get this because they still look at the traditional approach of protecting their systems, of having the firewall and having, this is our piece of the internet and you can't come in, when fundamentally most of their applications are either in the cloud or in disparate locations. The idea has really pivoted and has moved on. Now, just because you have those firewalls, those controls in place, you want to make sure that you are not trusting things that are, inside, I did air quotes, sorry about that, inside your firewall. You want to make sure that just because it's something internal to your network, that is being challenged as well. You want to make sure that you're verifying everything all the time. Another example, too, is the wonderful idea of, being environmentally friendly. It's always fantastic to look at this because we want to make sure that we're taking care of Mother Earth. We want to make sure that we are recycling most things, but not passwords. If you're reusing passwords on multiple applications, guess what? You're going to have a really bad day at some point because the attackers love to compromise systems, take those accounts that they get, and then replay them against other sites and try and gain more access. This happens every day on the internet, no matter what. So why make it easier for the attacker? Good idea. Because a password is very, very simple. Just because you come up to the castle wall and say, let me in because the word of the day is Apple, doesn't mean that you're supposed to be there, because you can be challenged. And then when they realize that you're not the person that's supposed to be there, they can make you go away. So before I ever got into computer security in any way, shape, or form, I started out in a degree in archaeology. Didn't expect to have that turn today, did you? Well, one of the lessons that I took away from that was the sack of Rome in 410 AD. What happened here was the Visigoths took the city by surrounding it and waiting until the Romans ran out of resources. So they were able to prove demonstrably in 410 AD that a traditional perimeter-based approach to security was broken. So here we are, many, many moons later, still talking about it. And we got to make sure that we are addressing these sort of things because we keep making the same mistakes over and over again. For example, if you're going for a hike in the woods, you want to make sure that you're a little faster than the hiker behind you is typically the joke here in Canada, but that doesn't really serve to protect everyone. It is a running joke because you can't do that. You can't leave somebody out to dry, because if one company is compromised on the internet, they then could potentially be used to compromise everything else. And we have to understand there are more than enough bears to go around, that you can't just leave one poor hiker to go for it, because we got lots of issues that we have to contend with. And we got to make sure that we're being smart about it, because security has a historical bad name, and we have to own that. We have to put the tip of the sword against our chest and lean forward and own it, because we used to be this guy. This is the flaming sword of justice. And I refer to this quite literally as a person I used to work with many, many years ago. And his entire mantra was, how do we get to know? He would run around the office trying to get people fired all the time. Thankfully, he had absolutely no ability to do so, but he continued nonetheless. And this did nothing to improve security in the organization. It just caused the rest of the organization to have a very dim view of security. And then fundamentally, when myself and a few other compatriots ended up taking over that part of the business and he left, things did get better, but not after a very, very long conversation with many business units. And we have to be understanding that bad things are going to continue to happen. Now, normally this is the part where I stand in front of an audience and say, how many people here are familiar with Amazon S3 buckets? In most security conferences, I would hope to see everybody's hand go up. And I'm actually surprised how often I have people that have quizzical looks. And that's not to, deride them in any way, shape, or form, but I thought this was something that was well known, and apparently I was misinformed. Now, I bring that up as an example because this is one of the many ways that we get data breaches today. For those of you who don't know, an Amazon S3 bucket is a data repository you can spin up with a web browser and a credit card. You can put whatever you need to in it, code, it can be image files, whatever it happens to be, in order to get your application to work. Now, the issue here is that when you set it up, by default, let me say that again, by default, it is set to private. They say in rather bold print, please do not make this public unless you absolutely know what you're doing. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the idea. And regrettably, all too often I read stories about companies that have been compromised in this way because these S3 buckets were made public and people were able to gain access to them, and to rather negative ends for some organizations. It doesn't have to be like this. And I don't vilify the people who do this, because typically they're not security people that are setting these up. It is incumbent upon us as security practitioners to make sure that we are communicating these types of risks to a wider audience. We need to get far better at having these communication talks, because things like this will continue to happen. In the Verizon DBIR and various other reports out there, we see this sort of thing year over year, where 81% of data breaches involved weak credentials, or 70% of them in compromised devices. This will vary by a percentage point here and there year over year, but it's continuous. We need to do a better job, because we have to understand that that perimeter that we look at and say, oh, it's okay, we have a castle wall, is really quite porous. We have all sorts of different ways into the organization. For those of you familiar with Shodan, great example. You can quickly search on there for RDP connections as one example. And there are many times where you can find an RDP connection that has no password on it whatsoever. You are then on that particular network. Thankfully, more often than not, that's somebody's personal computer as opposed to part of an organization, but not always. We have to make sure that we are looking at the perimeter these days as anywhere an access decision is being made. I'm a big fan of repetition, and full props to my boss, Wendy Nather. That is her line specifically, because the perimeter has changed completely. We have remote employees, never more true than now, hybrid clouds, personal devices, mobile devices, you name it. We run the gamut. So when we're talking about zero trust, we need to make sure that we're focusing on the access for the application, for the users, and the devices. And if we are not taking the time to protect those properly, then unfortunately we're going to end up with rather negative consequences. But this isn't anything new. So if we jump back in time to 2012, at that point in time, I was rather bored one summer, and I started collecting data on various data breaches that were happening. And this was taken right from my website, libertymatrix.org, which is somewhat defunct at this point, but I was tracking these things, and it was amazing at the time. There was one particular site here that had 6.5 million records that were compromised. That seemed like such a big thing. But in reality, this wouldn't even get a second mention these days when you have sites being compromised with the order of magnitude of billions of records compromised. It's really a troublesome thing. And I know how troublesome that can be because I've lived through it myself. This is a screenshot from one of the servers on my network when I was working at one organization back in 2008 that was compromised. This was a bad day. This was a system that I was told was being taken offline. It had been dealt with, no problems, don't worry about it. And I unfortunately trusted the business group in question to do exactly what they said they were going to do. Unfortunately, priorities being what they are, they ended up being pulled into a special project, and this remained online. I came into work that morning, and, well, sure enough, my phone was ringing off the wall with all different news organizations from around the world saying, oh, what happened? That was not a fun day. And this keeps happening. Not to me, thankfully. But when I look at this site here, this is from a site called informationisbeautiful.net. Now, this is from 4 or 5 years ago here, where it does a graphical representation of multiple data breaches with absolutely staggering numbers of records. Now, if we flash forward in time to a few years ago, then we see that it keeps getting worse. So much so that this site, informationisbeautiful.net, had to actually change how they were presenting the data because it wouldn't fit on the screen anymore. Let me just step back. This was 4 or 5 years ago. This was about 3 years ago. It is not getting better. So how do we address this? Well, we have to get back to tackling the core fundamentals. We have to make sure that we are tackling access in a way that makes sense. Kill your passwords, for one. So let's have a look in the States. What is open? So at the time that I did this a couple days ago, there's 182 million plus ports that were open and listening. Not a bad thing in of itself. You need them open in order to get things done, but you can understand that there is a subset of these that will have security issues, to be sure. In Hawaii specifically, 127,000 were just over that were open and listening. Now, if we poke through them, and this is at the US scale, not just at the local Hawaii scale, we found 952 systems were susceptible to eternal blue, which is a rather bad compromise. When I say we, I mean me. We had 48,000 plus systems that were vulnerable to heartbleed. I don't get that. This is something we've known about for quite a few years now. I think we're over 5 years. And yet we still find a large swath of systems that could be compromised. And just think about it. These systems could be compromised and then pivot to attack others. Another example, Bluekey, 21,000 plus. That's super bad. So what do? We have to look at the value proposition of dealing with trusted access or zero trust overall. We have to make sure that we're devaluating the stolen credentials that the attacker can get. We want to make sure that we're making those low-hanging fruit go away. We have to complicate lateral movement throughout the organization. If an attacker can break into a system and then pivot to other systems throughout your network, that is not a good thing. I know back in the heyday, in the early or late 90s, I was able to do this in pretty much every system I ever tested. And hopefully this has gotten a lot better. I haven't been doing the hands-on testing for quite some time, but based on the news, I assume that this is a trouble spot as well. We don't need to make the attacker's job any easier than it already is. So we have to look at the idea of what was originally called bastion hosts. How do we approach it so that laptops, desktop servers are treated in such a way that they are, properly secured no matter where they are plugged in? A DMZ is, typically is the secure aspect where systems on the inside tend to have not the same level of security, and this is from a traditional sense. I hope this is getting better, but it was the idea of the hard outer exterior and the soft chewy inside. There were far too many times I found systems on the inside that were running entire versions of Microsoft Office Suite on a production server. And I asked why, and it was simply because we had a license for it. Not a good way to approach things. We need to set the expectations. Where is it we're trying to get from a zero trust perspective? The easiest, for a starting point is, something like making sure you're doing rationalization of the users in your organization. Make sure you're doing rationalizing of the user devices, network zone segmentation, multi-factor authentication. These are all elements that can help reduce risk, but don't try to do them all at once. You have to look at it as a game of increments. You want to go through and try to do one piece at a time. It's sort of like eating an elephant. You only take one bite at a time. You don't try to do it all at once. And fundamentally, you have to look at it. What are my priorities as an organization? Why am I doing this? What is it I'm trying to protect? Far too often you tell us, talk to a security person and say, oh, what is it you're trying to protect? And it's like the organization. I was like, well, so what specifically? And having them drill down in that conversation is always an interesting one, because you will get, the older folks like myself, gray beard is natural. You'll get one way of looking at it, and younger folks might have a different perspective. And this is where we need to communicate more with each other in order to, have these discussions about risk, because the attackers keep coming. So here's a great example. If your system was compromised and your usernames and passwords were dumped on the internet, and you didn't know about it for about, let's say 24 hours, just 24 hours, and they were being actively used against your organization, how would you know? Ponder that for a second. Legitimate credentials compromised for just a day. Most reports say that's usually about 200 days before anybody notices they've been compromised. Imagine just a single day, the amount of damage that could be done with legitimate credentials. And how do you prevent systems that are, not patched to current from accessing your resources? Do you have somebody with a Windows ME laptop that's trying to come into your network? You might laugh, but I've seen this sort of thing not all that long ago. We want to look at security best practices, we want to verify the users, we want to verify the devices and protect every application, because the attackers will keep coming at you. And when I talk about, attackers compromising systems and then reusing passwords, if you have multi-factor authentication in place, as an example, or they can compromise your username and password from a third-party site, but they won't have that second factor. And if you have your device inventory set up where you have trusted devices, they won't be able to do that because ostensibly they don't have that trusted device. If they compromise the trusted device as well, they don't have the second factor. So it is limiting the amount of damage that they could do fundamentally in your organization. Now, devices with poor security hygiene, you want to make sure you're controlling this. And unfortunately, we are in a reality now where a BYOD is part of the doing business for a lot of organizations. So being able to, catalog that device. So if somebody comes in with that device and sets up so that they are going to use that for work, you can then have that in your inventory. So it's a known good at that point from the perspective of you've seen it before. You want to make sure that the software is up to date. It has some sort of security configuration which you can enforce. And then, what's the risk of that device? Do they have a screensaver in it? Do they have the hard disk encryption? All the rest of it. These are the kind of things that if they pass all of these things that you specify, then you can allow them to access your on-premise app, your cloud apps, whatever it happens to be. Oops, pardon me. I doubled up a slide. Well, I'll use it anyway because I'm a big fan of repetition. Trusting your identities, your devices, user device combinations, securing access to all your applications, and looking for those anomalies because people are going to do weird stuff. So if we look at it from the idea of somebody accessing with zero trust, how does it work? Well, first off, the user is then going to request access to an application, Salesforce, email, whatever it happens to be. Then you establish the trust of the device and the user identity with strong authentication, be it multi-factor authentication, biometrics, whatever it happens to be. Then you evaluate the trustworthiness of the device. Is that device a good one? Is it one that's been jailbroken and has some sort of issue where there's a default SSH password locked in there and things to that effect? Then if they pass all of those tests, you can then enforce policies on that device and then enable a secure connection to that application so that it isn't somebody just willy-nilly coming in because they found a username and password. And then monitor for those anomalies. We want to make sure that in order to get to a zero trust program, we have to do our homework first. We have to build out an asset inventory of users and devices. We want to make sure that we have proper user management. Do you have a staff add remove process that makes sense? Do you have users that are still enabled in your organization that haven't been there for years? One organization I worked at for a very long time ago, I was there for about a week and we did an assessment on our systems and found 10 user accounts that were super user status that belonged to people that were no longer with the company. One of them had been dead for 5 years and they had used their account in the last 2. So this was a real problem. So this was an example of, having bad management of our user inventory. And this is something that can really come back and bite you in the posterior. You want to make sure you have solid device management and have defined repeatable processes in your organization. ITIL is a fantastic example of this. I was at one company where we did an ITIL rollout, and the CIO said at the beginning of the year, we're going to do no new projects for the rest of the year, just maintain on our current ones, and we're going to roll out ITIL. And we all went, sorry, what? It turned out to be an absolute excellent decision because in the first 3 months after we deployed ITIL, and that was a very long process to get to there, we reduced the rate of incidents in our organization by 76%. We were able to track it and show demonstrable metrics to go with it. And this is the kind of thing that you can do yourself. You don't need some vendor to come in and tell you how to do it. You can have these defined repeatable processes that will fundamentally reduce risk in your organization as long as you're using them and tuning them over time, because you don't want to do the Ron Popeil method of set it and forget it, because that's never going to work out for you well. You want to be able to look at the user and device behavior analytics once you have this in place. And for the love of all that's good and holy, network zone segmentation. I worked at another organization a very long time ago, which had a flat network that spanned the globe. MPLS circuits as far as the eye could see. I could sit at my office in Toronto and query systems in Southeast Asia and Europe, and nobody was the wiser. This doesn't have to be this way. There was no reason for me to even try to access those systems. So why do we do this? It sort of harkens back to the firewall any rule that we've seen all too many times. There's no good reason for this. Now we look at those ports that we're talking about earlier, and I went through there and I pulled out one example here. Was an SSH port that was listening. This is one example that I just pulled at random. Had a whole lot of issues. This is not a good thing. But think about this. One, needle in a haystack, which I just happened to pick at random, had all these vulnerabilities. If an attacker was able to breach that particular system, who knows what they would have had access to beyond that. Well, lots of systems too. That was a lot of SSH systems listening that day. So we want to make sure that we are doing encryption in the right way. When people ask for backdoor to be built into it, you need to tell them to go fish. We need to make sure that we are securing our data. We are securing our data at flight, in flight and at rest. There are things like, MIT's CryptDB is a great example of an encrypted database that you can do searches on. It's a very cool thing to look up, worth having a check. We can do better things, and we don't want to be, inadvertently compromising our own systems by trying to play nice with others. There's a better way forward. And one of those great examples is WebAuthn. This is an open standard that was published about 1.5 years ago by W3C. Now, if you take nothing else away from this talk, please take this and go read about this. This is a way of implementing passwordless authentication within your applications. This is the next new hotness, and this is something that I hope more and more people will read about, because this is a great way to look at getting rid of static passwords. So let me explain. There's a whole lot to sum up, so I'll go through it real quick. Assume your network is hostile. You want to establish a trust engine. You want to reduce the attack surface because the attackers are going to come at you from every which way. And if you make it easier for them, they will continue to come for you. You want to continually validate for authorization and keep it simple. You want to then communicate all of this with your peers in order to ensure that everybody comes up to the same level of security. Because if we don't share these stories with each other, we're going to continue to have problems as a wider ecosystem. Build that asset inventory. Get a solid hold on your user management. What is on your network? Every organization I've ever worked at, the first thing I came through the door is I said, okay, what's on the network? And they'll say, a bunch of stuff. Or my favorite of all was one organization. I said, where's the asset inventory? Oh, that's a spreadsheet on Frank's computer, and he's on vacation for 2 weeks. Outside of the name Frank, everything about that was accurate. I changed the name to get him off the hook, but that is one of those kind of things you have to look at. You want to make sure you have defined repeatable processes so that you are not making the same mistakes over and over again. Look for the behavior analytics, and please look at network zone segmentation. There is no reason you should be running across hot coals. You should have your slipper. You should be able to be nice and calm and cool and not have to worry about security. You want to be able nice and relaxed, because we have to really get to that sense of Palekana. We have to get to that safe and secure feeling across the board, not just as the individual, but as the internet at large. Because we need to reduce the risk, we need to reduce costs, and fundamentally we need to improve our sleep overall and find our chill, as it were. What's not to love about that? Well, I'd like to say mahalo to everyone that's been listening today. And if you have any questions or comments for me, feel free to drop me an email at gattaca@duo.com or gattaca@cisco.com. And conversely, you can find me at Twitter ranting and raving about random things at the best of times. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time is valuable, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dave. Great talk. I especially like the way that you ended, on that beautiful photo of where we cannot be right now, but would like to be mentally. So going into some questions here to be mindful of that is when we come to Zero Trust, and given that you've had a lot of experience there, be able to talk about where we see most companies being effective. Is there a maturity model to way to think about hey, this is where most companies kind of start at. We see really, really good companies getting to a place where they are a level 4.
Oh, yeah, it sounds like a CMM. So yeah, there is no tool like that, but where you can start is what I was talking about earlier, making sure you do your homework, rationalizing the user's devices and applications, your organization. And if you are already in the process of doing that or have done that, you're actually on your way towards a zero trust framework. Now, the easiest way to get beyond that is, my gateway drug routine is multi-factor authentication. Because we've been stuck with static passwords for a very long time, and static passwords, I always look at them as putting your key under your doormat in front of your house. Somebody, you might put it there so your kid can come home and get in early when you're at work, but that doesn't mean that's the person coming through the door. The attackers know this. They look for it under the mat, in the mailbox, under the the plastic rock in the garden. So multi-factor authentication is a great way to reduce the risk and get you started off on that way, so that you are ensuring the people that are accessing the resources in your network are the ones that are supposed to be there, and not somebody that just happened to find the key.
And I like the way that you open the talk because not only does it touch on just where zero trust has come today, but also some of the new challenges that we're seeing in being able to adopt zero trust framework with everyone working from home. So with trying to now account for the different bringing your own devices, those different decisions that we're trying to have to make. Do you happen to see where we'll see more like tech debt buildup, trying to meet these new standards, and we kind of just have a bunch of things that are lingering around, trying to ramp up?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really going to get to a critical mass from a perspective of security debt when we look back to March. And there's so many organizations that had to move really quickly in order to get people to be remote and supply them with the resources or enable them in order to get their jobs done. Because, like, let's face it, most of the people that are working remote, historically, outside of the occasional Friday, were never remote workers. And in most cases, they're not technically adroit. So we have to make sure that we are enabling to do their jobs. As a result, a lot of sacrifices happened along the way. So risks that were accepted back in March and since then have to be tracked and addressed, because I think that security debt is going to compound over time. And I very much don't want to see that, but these are the kind of things like static passwords. I mean, kill your passwords. It's a great way to help reduce risk. Be it multi-factor authentication, passwordless, biometrics. There are better ways to do authentication.
Okay. Speaking of better ways to do authentication, one thing that I really enjoy about LocoMocoSec is that you kind of see a bunch of different talks that kind of touch on, best practices. One thing that you touched on is kind of an ask for more WebAuthn. And actually, we had Philippe talk about WebAuth and relying on that yesterday, and said there's a lot of benefits on it. He did touch on the drawbacks, and I kind of want to see how you consider those some of those drawbacks as he kind of speaks in retrograde. Some of the drawbacks that he touched on, and granted, this won't be in the context of his entire talk, is new training and mechanism and workflow for most of our users, since people aren't really using this today. On the server side, handling of signatures is very sensitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, it's not as easy as. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'll just say, like, the last part was just like it can only do like a full password replacement in controlled environments. Those are just the three things.
Well, yeah, and we have to look at it too as the idea is, WebAuthn is not at a place where it can handle legacy applications right now as well. So yes, there are limitations, but it is better than absolutely nothing at this point, because it is really a good starting point. And it's really about getting people to pay attention. Mainly, I love this because it is an open standard. This is not a vendor-driven anything. And yes, obviously there are going to be limitations. There are going to be things with something brand new. That's to be expected. But you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater just because something is slightly akimbo. We want to make sure that we are taking the time to look for better ways to do things. WebAuthn is a great first. And there's a lot of smart people that are on these conferences that can look at this and go, wait a minute, what if we do X? So having conversations like this to help improve that. Yeah, there are limitations, absolutely, but any technology has limitations. So I would never look at that as a stopping moment. I look at it as how do we make it better?
All right. Well, thank you very much, as always, Dave, for being here with us, and always glad to have you a part of the LocoMocoSec family. Aloha and mahalo, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Well, very near future.
Likewise. Likewise. Mahalo.